I told you it's too obscure.
Conveying information may be more important than rhyming. Well, hello and welcome to the Hackaday podcast. I'm Elliot Williams.
And I'm Al Williams.
This is episode 263, Better DCMA, AI Spreadsheet Play, and Home Assistance Your Way. This week in the news, I wanted to start off with an article for two different reasons. You should be allowed to fix McDonald's ice cream machines, say federal regulators. This is news coming out of the Federal Trade Commission that I guess we've reported on the Taylor McDonald's ice cream machine hack where a company wanted to retrofit a Raspberry Pi to do some routine monitoring and stuff, and they got hit with a DMCA, Digital Millennium Copyright Act lawsuit. It now looks like the FTC is saying that this is a part of, there's actually section 1201 of the DMCA, which allows for reverse engineering for repair and other uses like that. And it looks like they're even thinking of expanding the kind of default bucket exception for repair and reverse engineering, which is absolutely fantastic because if you read the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, it does have these exemptions for interoperability and repair and things, but they have been very successfully litigated by large firms that want to claim that the password in their code that prevents you from reloading their printer cartridges, for instance, is copyrightable material. And first of all, the idea that a password is a copyrightable work of art just makes my head spin. But I think a lot of that isn't actually in the Digital Millennium Copyright Act itself, but in the kind of body of court cases around it.
Case law, yeah.
Case law. And that is just, that is bad karma, left, right, and center. So it looks like they're going to fix it and make the law more specific in these cases, which would be fantastic for everyone.
Oddly enough, I wrote the original coverage on this back in 2021. And, I learned a couple of interesting things looking at this. I mean, first of all, Taylor has manuals for these machines online. And if you look them up, you can read what the error codes mean. So apparently the McDonald's franchisees hadn't figured that out. But I think the other issue here is that there is a little bit of weirdness because the ice cream machines don't work the way other ice cream machines do. So you actually thaw them out every night usually and clean them, but McDonald's doesn't want to do that. So the machines have some cycle where they literally pasteurize the machine, refreeze the ice cream, which, now that you've heard that, you don't want to eat ice cream anymore from that machine. So it's a little bit of a safety hazard if you have somebody dinking with it. So there's a little argument there. But surely, if I could read the codes out of the manual, putting a Raspberry Pi on it isn't the thing that's terrible, right? I could see if it was just so locked down because they were worried about hurting somebody. But it's not that locked down. They just didn't want some other company doing it with a Raspberry Pi. And that gets into less of the protected password stuff and more just, please don't hook things up to our wires and read what's going over those wires. And I'm not sure how protectable that is in any event.
Not.
So, one of the rare cases where it seems like maybe the powers that be are on the right side of those arguments, which is not always the case, right?
We've actually published a couple other articles where people in the comments have raised concerns that things are violating the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. And that's part of the problem, is that it's nebulous about what is and what comes out under the Section 1201 exemptions and, what the courts will say, because in the end, it's one of these copyright law cases, right, where the actual outcome's kind of decided in court. So yoicks, it's scary. It's great to see if the FTC is going to clear some of this stuff up a little bit.
Well, now I want ice cream.
But that's but that's not the reason I wanted to discuss this post, or at least it's half the reason. The other is that this is 50,000th post published on Hackaday. Woohoo! So some kind of crazy milestone.
Well, since we had the podcast issues, I think we should point out it's 50,000 decimal, right?
Right. Oh, man. Mike Stitch comes in and says, that's not a number worth celebrating. Wait till you get to 65,000, whatever, 2 to the 16th. And yeah, I'm not playing that game anymore. This is 50,000. Congratulations. Our odometer is halfway rolled over. I'm pretty stoked about that.
The comment I liked was from Dave that said, "Congrats also on 6,534 bookmarks in my browser." Not joking. So I'm going to take that at face value. Thanks, Dave.
Yeah, sometimes it's the number of open tabs I have in a given day, right? 15 different Hackaday tabs open.
I need to be a member of Tabs Anonymous, you know.
Shall we head on off to What's That Sound?
Oh boy.
This is a journey into sound.
What's that sound?
What's that sound?
Outside of the phaser, I never get these. So. Well, memories of my childhood, that sure sounded like.
Oh, 100%.
Oh, wow.
Bam.
Cool. Okay. Might want to edit that part out.
I will have to bleep that out and but loud. Congratulations.
Thank you. That's two now. I think I'm two for 200, I think.
I thought you were going to get this one, actually. I was going to put down either some kind of radio modulation thing or this one to throw you a bone.
Oh, there you go.
I'm happy. Yeah, well, if you listeners out there have an idea about what this sound is, head on over to hackaday.com/podcast. In the show notes, find the section where it says, "What's that sound?" Click to the linked web form, fill in your handle, your best guess, and your email address, and next week we'll pick a lucky winner from the right answers. And without further ado, let's head off to the hacks. One is one that I know Al and I have both been interested in over the kind of last 5 years. Your voice assistant doesn't have to be cloudy. And this is a hack by Tristan, but it's also kind of an update on the state of the art of voice control in the Home Assistant smart home framework. And it's really interesting for both of these. The hardware itself is actually basically a board he bought and some 3D printing and a couple speakers. It's kind of, modules off the shelf lashed together. It's not super complicated. What's interesting is the rest of the setup and how easy that is to do. The board in question uses an ESP32 and streams the audio to another computer in his house that's running Home Assistant and does the heavy lifting with the audio. And I think that's kind of interesting. Tristan links in his write-up to Home Assistant's initiative for last year, which is making 2023 the year of voice control. And so they have 5 or 6 blog posts explaining how to set up Home Assistant for either the case where you want to do wake word detection and analysis on the edge on each device. And that unfortunately requires the computing power on whatever that device is to be kind of a Raspberry Pi Zero V2 or greater, it looks like. And that's just because simply wake word detection is hard. You have to listen for one word all the time in whatever background noise and whatever levels and auto gain control. And there's all sorts of kind of continuous DSP processing that needs to go on to do wake word detection. In this case, the processor on the board is an ESP32, and all it's doing is streaming the audio off to another computer in his network that then is doing the wake word detection. The rest of the setup with Home Assistant is actually pretty straightforward, and you can train it to do particular words you're interested in and phrases and stuff. It looks like the ability to do completely independent, autonomous, self-run, non-hosted voice detection and voice response is come a long way in the last year.
Well, this is typical of one of these things where not very long ago this would have been a massive project, and now it's some off-the-shelf boards. And, Home Assistant itself has come a long way, but also just the availability of these relatively high-powered computers at a low price. One of the things that struck me when I was reading this, the key here is it's local, which is good, right? Because you don't really trust, the giant companies to listen to everything you say, but they're going to throw all of it away except when you say, hey, Gustav, or whatever your wake word is. I've read in the popular press lately that both Google and Amazon are kind of stepping back from these home assistants.
Yeah.
And, people are being laid off and it's not really turning into the thing that they wanted. And I can't figure out what's really going on there. I mean, one answer is maybe people don't want this at all. Certainly in my household, I will command things by voice, but a lot of people just tell me to do it. And then I say the same, turn the thermostat to 50. Okay, turn the thermostat to 50. On the other hand, it could be too that people don't want Big Brother listening in to everything they say. And I think that's a legitimate. So that's kind of a podcast Ask Hackaday is why aren't you using the commercial voice assistants? Is it privacy? Is it that they don't do anything you want? Is it not that interesting? They're certainly cheap enough. And then from the company's point of view, I can't figure out if they're all just going to evacuate because they think they're going to stick AI in it and then have something so different, or if it's kind of the I don't know if you remember because you may not have been in the U.S. at the time, but Kmart rolled out free internet service and then was shocked when no one went and shopped at Kmart using their free internet service. And so they backed away from that. So I don't know if people thought, oh, once you have the voice assistant, you'll be ordering stuff from us 20 times a day. And you don't. You use it to turn on your lights and your garage door and all those kind of things. So I think it'd be interesting to see if you had really high quality local controllers like this that did useful things, would they be more popular than the Big Brother brand voice assistants? And certainly something like this could be viable.
I think you focused on the end user wanting it. I think the end user does want it, maybe modulo the privacy concerns, but I think you finally touched on it in the end. I think Amazon has discovered that they're just not making that much money doing it. And so, it may be something that we want and enjoy and have fun with, but not in the way that makes them money. And so then they don't want to make the device anymore, right? Like, I think they were selling them as some kind of a loss leader. I know at least when they went on sale, they were tremendously cheap. And then they have to run the services behind it, right? So it's not just the physical device, but Amazon must be looking at, all that processing power that supports all of this cloud-based voice recognition stuff. And they must have to justify that. And if people aren't buying more detergent based on this, it's just not going to pad their bottom line. So they're going to bail out. That would be my guess for why Amazon's backing off, and probably Google too. I mean, that's my guess for why the big companies are backing off of it, even if there were consumer demand, because, all the things we did with ours back when we were running it more, I don't think any of them were making Amazon a penny. Like, we didn't order things with it, but we used it
Right.
to, made a great kitchen timer because your hands are busy when you
Yes,
need
I
to
do
set
that
a
all the
10-minute
time.
timer. Or, remind me that I need to buy toilet paper, but then not place an order with Amazon, but then just put toilet paper on the next time we go shopping, right? We made a shopping list with it and would, just write it down before we went out shopping, which totally undoes their value proposition. And I felt bad about it, but not bad at all.
Well, it has gotten increasingly bad where it's got a notification for you and you ask it what it is. And it's like, well, I noticed you had looked at, history of World War II and there's a book on sale. Would you like me to put it in your cart? And it kind of reminds me of the red dwarf toaster, right? Would you like some toast? And it's like, no, I don't want any toast. Well, toast is really delicious. And it's because that's its reason for being, is it's a toaster. It's kind of the same thing here. It's like, well, I'm here to sell stuff for Amazon. But I agree. I can't remember the last time, if ever, I've actually bought anything, especially from the annoying prompts of, hey, I think you might be out of fizzy sodas. Do you want to order some more? And just on principle, I don't, right? I mean, even if I want it now, I'm not going to do it. So
If you haven't seen Cory Doctorow's enshittification talk that he gave as the keynote speech at last SuperCon, it's exactly about this and how, as they get more desperate to get more money out of it, they do more invasive advertising and it just gets worse. I think a lot of us have felt that. Anyway, that all said, that makes this sort of push by Home Assistant so much more useful, right? Like, if they're going to fold up their service and take it away, but you still want voice control for your home automation system, you're going to have to do it yourself. And here we go. So it's really, really cool. I think what's interesting, like I said, I've been following this space for a few years now, is that a lot of the backend software that people are using these days has changed. There was Jeeves and stuff before, and the voice synthesis side, they were using CMU Sphinx and stuff like that. And these days, the kind of preferred software is all different. And so that's very interesting as well to see these new open voice detection, voice response, and text to speech projects all coming up. And the one that I thought was really neat here was Open Wake Word. I'll throw the links in the show notes, but again, it's a how to train yourself a machine learning wake word detection algorithm. And this is one that runs on, say, a Raspberry Pi. It's the one that runs on the slightly more powerful computers to which the ESP32 is streaming it. And what's really neat about this is A, you can train it yourself. So you can train it on your particular background noise, whatever that is, and you can train it on your particular desired wake word. You have to, spend some process time on it, but I don't think that's impossible. The other thing it does, if you're streaming to it from a bunch of, say, ESP32 based devices around your house, it knows from which device it received the command. And so Home Assistant now has some stuff in there that says, when you say turn the lights off, it knows which microphone heard you say turn the lights off. So it knows in which room you mean turn the lights off. Well, I guess Open Wake Word sends that as a piece of information. It sends, I received a wake word and from which device. And then the Home Assistant system takes that and turns off the lights in the correct room that you're in. And that makes that interaction just, a heck of a lot more natural and reasonable than, hey, Alexa, turn off the bedroom lights. You just want to say, turn off the lights.
Well, and in all fairness, Alexa and Google both can do that if it's set up properly. But one thing that's very annoying about the Google setup is, I have a Google phone and I'll be sitting in the living room and I'll say, oh, I want to know what the weather is tomorrow. So I say, hey, you know who? What's the weather tomorrow? Because I don't want to trigger every device in my office right now. And, I'll say, hey, what's the weather tomorrow? And then distantly from the bedroom speaker, you hear, and you're like, because it heard me and it decided, oh, I'm better than a phone. I'll answer, except I'm not in the bedroom. It's just the sound carries in there.
Oh, that's
so
funny.
that's not always ideal. Although I agree, home automation having that capability is awesome. And I'm sure you could figure it out. I mean, I could, in fact, do something about that if I were to baffle it or move the other device, or there's got to be some way to fix that. But I think that's one of the things that really appeals to me about home automation, too, is, most of us, all of us probably, have the ability to say, I don't like how that works. I'm going to fix it, right? So I would not be adverse to going in and saying, well, when you hear this from here, I want these rules followed. But the big guys are notoriously bad at doing that because, frankly, not everybody can do that, and you don't want the support calls. So that's very appealing that I could write my scripts without having to go through some other wacky consumer level 50-click step to get some kind of script done, just to be able to say, well, let me slap out 20 lines of Python and I'm done. That's just very appealing to me.
And 2 years from now, when that service decides that it's not profitable and shutters, you're still going to have your own stuff running at home. And your stuff running at home is only going to get better because people are working on it. So, I think the time to transition is probably now. If you're doing your home automation, voice activation stuff using one of the bigger services, it's looking like the DIY option has gotten almost to parity. I don't think it's quite there yet, but I think it's so close that it's getting absolutely tantalizing to switch over because one future is going to get brighter and the other is going to get darker.
But I can't order my multivitamins on my home assistant.
You will have to order your multivitamins on the internet like a normal person. You're going to have to fire up a computer, man.
First world problem. Okay, my first one this week, very controversial one. Learn AI via Spreadsheet from Spreadsheets Are All You Need. That was the name given. I'm sure that's not really the name. So, I have a bad habit of abusing spreadsheets, but I have to take my hat off. This particular spreadsheet is, forget how many megabytes, but It actually is GPT-2's algorithm, and it will sit there and do basically chatbot operations in a spreadsheet. Now, there's some limitations. You have to break things up into tokens yourself. Obviously it's slow and huge. And of course, GPT-2 is fairly small. It's got, 768 different pieces. But, the real story here, and I know you're going to have something to say about this, Elliot, but the real story here is not that I want to do AI in a spreadsheet. But, I frequently will do something like, say, a circuit design with a spreadsheet, or I've simulated some CPUs in a spreadsheet. And the reason for that is if you give it to somebody, almost everybody knows how the spreadsheets work. And if I say, well, here's my C++ code, you know how that is. Reading somebody else's code is painful. And, not that we don't do it all the time and we can't do it, but having that spreadsheet really encourages you to go, how does that work? Well, what if I change this, right? It's very easy to do that and very accessible. There's also a series of videos that I don't think all of them are out yet, but I actually enjoyed watching them. So, for example, and this is probably old hat to you, Elliot, but, they always talk about how they tokenize the input. And I never really understood why that was, because a token doesn't necessarily mean a word. So it might say, Hackaday is a great website, and the tokens might be Hackaday is a great web site. And so it breaks them up into like almost syllables, but not exactly. The explanation for that was on the video was that if you encoded words and you had 700 or 800 of them like GPT-2 has, then you'd have 700 or 800 words and that's it. But in fact, because you're doing the little pieces, like website, but you also would know construction site, or, it's not a good example because construction site's 2 words, but you would put those things together that make up words, little pieces that make up words. And what's even more impressive is that you get the benefit of saying, like, if I were to tell you, that was uncoded, well, maybe that's not really a word, but you knew what I meant, right? It's something we haven't coded yet because it's not coded. Or they had some very good examples that I should have been better prepared for with the spread on the videos. But the point of it is we can say things that don't actually make real words and still understand, well, means no, and then putting that on front of the word means know that word. Well, ChatGPT gets that same benefit by doing the token breakup. So less memory, less processing, more vocabulary, and more off the script vocabulary, which is probably one of the things that makes it seem a little more human than if it just said, gee, I don't know what the word, gluconeous means. Well, okay, it's going to make some attempt at figuring that out. So I think there's a lot of value to the videos. I think even if you don't want to load the 28 bazillion line spreadsheet that goes on, there was a lot of great detail about how that works. It was a great playground to actually go and experiment. Is it practical? No, but neither are half the things I deploy on spreadsheets. It's just more of a learning tool, and I thought this was that on steroids.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I do think that you can learn a lot by taking something and recoding it in a less appropriate method. And I think doing this in a spreadsheet is the wrong way to do it. Like, absolutely. But the question is, will you learn something from doing it that way? And the answer is, of course, yeah, totally. Some of the things a spreadsheet brings are like making the matrices of weights very obvious for people who don't have a good linear algebra background, which you absolutely need for AI stuff. So, you could see the rows and columns of a bunch of numbers, a bunch of these probabilities, right? And that kind of brings that home. And like you said, with the tokens, that's also super helpful to kind of, emphasize it that they actually have a token lookup table where it, has the word and then the token's number and then the associated probabilities with it. There is something kind of nice about the automatic way that the data gets presented to you in a spreadsheet. And I think what drives me crazy about programming in spreadsheets is that all of the logic is hidden. This is where I differ from you about using spreadsheets, because when you write code, the logic to do what needs to be done is right there in front of you. If I write a function to say, multiply this with that, it's right there. But if I'm in a spreadsheet, I have to click in that cell and then it says equals this cell times that cell, right? And it doesn't say what that cell represents either. It just says equals D13 times C22. And I'm like, oh crap, what's D13?
Well, that's because you're not naming ranges. But if you name ranges, you don't get that. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So you can turn your ranges into variable names, and that gets you,
Yes.
halfway
That's
there.
super helpful. Yeah. But I agree. You don't see it spelled out though. Yeah. You don't see it spelled out in order.
But I think that in that sense, the spreadsheet is kind of the the mirror image, the bizarro world equivalent of writing this in Python. Because in Python, you only see the functions and you don't see the data. And in the spreadsheet, you see the data, but the functions are kind of obscured from you. Are both useful? Absolutely. And I think that's, for me on the programming side, that's the big advantage of having, interactive programming languages where you can have the data in there in some stage of processing and just, printf it or send it out to a graphing program or, whatever. So you can see it update as you go along. And that kind of gives you what you would get out of the spreadsheet in the programming environment too, kind of the ability to introspect on the data. And I think that's super, super useful. I used to do a lot of coding on economics data and large data sets there. And that sort of thing's just absolutely fundamental. The ability to graph your data and then as you're transforming it, keep looking at things. It's a sanity check, but also gives you intuition about what's actually going on in the real world too. I see the value of doing this with spreadsheets as a learning tool, but I think you're totally right that this would not be the computationally efficient way to do it.
Well, and I'm always surprised. I mean, because, we've done that. I've got that kind of irregular series about spreadsheet DSP, and I link to that in the article where you do a Gertzel or a fast Fourier or whatever, and it's in a spreadsheet, so it's very accessible, even though, again, you're not going to really do that. But I've often thought, why don't we have a spreadsheet product somewhere where you say, oh, here's a cell. I would like to make this a Python cell. I mean, it's kind of Jupyter Notebookish, which is kind of what you were talking about. But Jupyter Notebook is not a spreadsheet. It's something else. It's more what you were describing. The interesting part to that is, I think what makes that hard is people don't realize. Years ago, I did a Fortran compiler, I should say transpiler, that took spreadsheet code and converted it to Fortran for some chemical engineers. And they said, well, why is this hard? Why don't you just start at A1 and then go to A2 and go to A3? And I'm like, well, because that's not how your spreadsheets work. You've built all these spreadsheets and you don't realize there's the natural order of calculation. And I had to convince them that that was true. Now, that was a few years back, right? But it does strike me that even that would be useful if a spreadsheet would say, hey, here's a report of all my calculations in order. And that's one of the reasons I think you don't see the Python as a spreadsheet cell, because that would make that much harder, right? To be able to say, oh, I see this cell depends on these 5 cells. So now I got to go recursively go, the second of those 5 cells now depends on this other cell. So I got to start back there, and you just keep recursing until you wind up with things that don't require any other cells. That's the natural order of calculation. But I don't think that's an insurmountable problem, right? I think it's just a problem. And I'm surprised we don't see more of that for just this kind of thing. Because I have seen people model chemical plants, and I'm sure you've seen giant economic models, software estimation like SearSim is all big, giant, difficult spreadsheets. And I can't help but think those wouldn't help you. But anyway, off the subject, but I do think the AI in a spreadsheet was worth checking out if you have any curiosity about how GPT works.
All right, my next hack is DIY RC controller built with old school parts. And this is a really fun hack by Phythion. It is using 2 chips in particular, the HT12E encoder and the HT12D decoder chips. And these are meant for use in like small home remote controls. And actually, these are the chips that are inside the brains of all of the remote light switches, remote appliance switches that we have. The 433 megahertz, kind of ubiquitous in Europe, remote wall socket switches have these HT12s in them. And I'd always kind of wondered how they worked. And I actually did look up the data sheet myself, but never thought about building a project with one until seeing this. What these chips do is they kind of serialize data for you. It starts with an address and then I think one of four possible on-off combinations. So it sends then a 4-bit status code. And the E encodes it up and the D decodes it up and does some validity checks on it, et cetera, et cetera. And this makes making a remote controller, of course, deadly simple. And in this case, he's doing it with 4x2 controls. He's doing kind of joysticks up, down, left, right, and two of them. Each joystick has one of these encoder and decoder chips on it. They're remarkably simple to use electronically on the output side, for instance, because what the D chips do is they have four outputs that go logic high when it gets a 1 across that channel and logic low when it gets a 0, right? They also have a valid data line, which is interesting if you want to do kind of any more processing. But these things are really meant for kind of lowest common denominator, cheap commercial appliances where you want to just take this voltage, have it drive a transistor and make a motor go or switch a relay on in the case of remote control wall socket things. It's really fun to see these used because, again, you mostly associate these parts with kind of not very sophisticated home devices. So it's kind of fun to see it used here for a hacker project, which is going to be a 2-joystick remote control for probably some kind of car or something. I think I saw wheels turning.
I'm always struck, and I mean, I come back to this over and over again. We live in the future. And yet we all figured out how to do stuff like this before you could just say, oh, I'll just get a chip that does that. But what a great world. I mean, I was just looking while you were talking. Heathkit, 1975, they had their 3-channel and 4-channel RC systems starting at $154.95, right? And those, so those were very easy. They basically just generated pulse widths and you had servos and, the pulse width was 1.5 milliseconds or it wasn't, and you got your control like that. Now you can do like you say, we get a chip and it's got all this digital encoding and it's Manchester biphase and you've probably got a module that's already got the radio and the antenna on it and you can get that for $4 if you're willing to wait. That's really amazing, and I think there's so much more we could be doing with that. I honestly haven't looked at the radio controlled space in a long time. A lot of ham radio operators are really into RC and other people, with airplanes and stuff, but surely they're doing a lot more now because you could just send command and control telemetry to it and you've got an onboard computer that reads that and does whatever you want it to do. You're not really limited to this kind of servo idea that you used to be. But that's what this reminded me of. It really reminded me of one of those old model aircraft controllers with the 2 sticks and the antenna coming out the middle of it. So
the RC world has gone all microcontroller and all protocol and makes a lot more sense in kind of this modern era. And in that sense, these chips are kind of a throwback to a simpler time when you wanted to send 4 ons and offs, which I guess is why they do find their main use in like cheap RC devices or things like these plug outlets that have 4 to a channel.
Yeah, your Christmas tree controller or whatever. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, they're perfect for that. And it's really, really kind of fun. Anyway, I just thought it was fun to see these. If you ever need to, send 4 on-off signals and you just don't want to do any of the brain work on figuring out a protocol that you could send over Wi-Fi or ESP now or whatever. This does it for you, and you hardwire up the channels on the sender and the receiver, and it must be 5 bits of unique ID, so you can have 32 devices times 4 channels each. You could get a lot going with these things. They're designed to hook straight up to a radio on either end as well. So you just take the output of this thing, plug it into a radio, it does on-off keying, sends it to the other one, which does then a little bit of validation on it and gives you your voltages. Couldn't be simpler.
This next hack is from Greg Hewler, and talking about doing more with less. He's got a breadboard software-defined radio that doesn't really require a whole lot of stuff, and it's the Talo mixer, but it's really stripped down to essentially the bare minimum. There's an analog switch and a quadrature signal coming out of a Raspberry Pi Pico. That quadrature clock and the analog mixer break the signal into differential I and differential Q couple of op amps, put it back together, shoot it up your sound card, and then you've got a software-defined radio. Now, the part he leaves off is you need a 20-meter long wire and a good ground to get anything. It's kind of like a crystal radio. This is real easy as long as you can hook it up to 500 feet of wire. But what an interesting thing that on a single breadboard with 3 really cheap chips, Pi Pico, which costs very little, and a handful of discrete parts, you can be experimenting with software-defined radio tonight. So I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, the Taylor detector is whatever detector quadrature decoder thing has always been a fascination of mine. It's really crazy. And, it's just a 4-way switch and you're just switching between, 4 different you're taking the input signal and breaking it up into 4 different output signals, just over and over again, each one set off by kind of 90 degrees in the sense that, you run the clock frequency into this multiplexer and it goes this one, then this one, then this one, then this one, this one, then this one, then this one, this one, all in regular intervals. That kind of gets you one signal that's 90 degrees out of phase from another, and that it works. So it seems incredibly blunt to me. The video does a great job of explaining how, kind of multiplying square waves is like turning things on and off. And that's like how the multiplexer selecting a channel gives you that same kind of multiplication thing, which is at the heart of a mixer. That's what gives you then the frequency downshifted components in each of the quadrature channels. Really, really interesting. And it's just the simplest possible device. And what's he using here? He's got a high-speed multiplexer. That's a 75-cent part. He's got a Pi Pico. That's $4. He's got something to generate the base frequency, right? He's got something to generate.
No, I think that's with the Pico. I think it's all in the Pico. He's got 2 op amps.
Yeah, he's generating the local oscillator with the Pico.
2 op amps.
The other thing's an op amp for a filter. All right.
52, and that's it. So.
Man, yeah, it's just like you say, it's on a breadboard. It's simple. You could probably get it done tonight. He specs the 74LV 4052, which I think is faster than the old school CMOS ones. So you probably want the LV part on this. But again, you may not have that part in your parts bin right now, but 75 cents will get you one.
I always wonder, you always hear about the prisoners of war making radios out of razor blades and safety pins. Is it going to be in the future they make an SDR because it's this easy, right?
Right. Well, my last hack is another home automation hack. I've got in my mind, I think partly because our home automation contest is going on and I keep looking at the spreadsheet. This one, 2024 Home Sweet Home Automation, a DIY SCADA smart home.
Can I interrupt you?
Yeah.
So, I've been in that business a long time, and maybe it's just in Texas, but we always say SCADA. I've never heard anybody say SCADA before, but can we have a rendition of you say SCADA, I say SCADA, let's call the whole thing off?
Oh, I think we just did. Or as they say in Texas, SCADA.
Thank you.
This is a DIY SCADA smart home by Stefan Schnitzer. And when we were thinking up this contest, we originally had a category for kind of the overkill involves everything in the house home automation system. And this fits that to a T. And along the way is also kind of a neat hacker introduction to SCADA as a kind of conceptual model about how you make these giant scale control systems. I think that's really cool. And his write-up over on Hackaday.io does kind of break this down into the different SCADA concepts. And I am by no means an expert here. I think I'm going to pull up my ringer, Al Williams, in a minute on this. It sounds a lot like the kind of models we have for doing networking, right? There's a level 0, which contains the actual devices. And then there's a level 1, which is the I/O capabilities then attached to the sensors. And then over that's a supervisory layer. And then there are kind of coordinating layers on top of that. And so you get this cascading flow of information up through the sensors and up into kind of higher aggregated systems, and then finally a control layer. This is kind of like the worked example of a SCADA system, as far as I can tell. But it also means that he's got all of the data logged and at his fingertips. And so he can answer, the important questions like, how much water does my coffee machine use every week? Because in addition to having, an automatic coffee refiller algorithm going, which he does. Byproduct of keeping all this information is that he knows all these things at the same time. And so that's really fun to watch here too, is that he uses, I guess, Node-RED for some of the control and Grafana for storing and collecting the data. And so he can kind of visualize it all at the same time. And it looks, very professional because he's using Node-RED for some of the logic. It's got, that flow graph style of control automation specification. I don't know what the word is for that. Control programming. And just a really interesting but insanely complicated project.
Yeah, I really was nostalgic at the picture because, it's a 19-inch rack with 2 DIN rails and a bunch of DIN relays in it. So I've seen that 2/3 of my career. This is very common in things like oil fields, and I actually did a system back in the 80s that wasn't terribly dissimilar from this that detected leaks in a saltwater pipeline. That was salt water was 99% salt brine, so leaking was terrible for the environment. And so this is really old tech, but what's interesting is there's tons of this stuff on the market, and it's one of those things where you just don't. It's like growing potatoes, right? They must grow billions of pounds of potatoes every day, but we don't really know it. We don't, unless you live somewhere where they grow potatoes and you don't see trucks constantly passing you full of potatoes that you know of. And so it's the same thing here. There's all this DIN technology, the PLCs, the field bus, mod bus, all this stuff that's out there. And if you know where to look, that's all there. Now, unfortunately, a lot of times that stuff's expensive. And that has gotten a lot better. You can go look on the usual Asian sources and get cheap PLCs, for example, but that used to not be the case. But also, there's a lot of software, a lot of logic for it. I think actually we're seeing some, not a lot, but some decline of this actually in industry because you're getting into things like smart sensors and, they're kind of coming more into let's have a network instead of the big box with 2,000 wires going to every part of our plant.
It's interesting also, he does have like some dedicated PLC boards, but then a lot of the other quote PLCs are really just Arduinos running soft PLC software. So it's not all professional gear he's got. He's kind of emulating some of it over the Arduini. But he does get to play around with all sorts of things. Like he's got Modbus and he's got Modbus over Wi-Fi and he's got, all sorts of crazy interconnects between all of these. It's a pretty big system, I think, and with a lot of diverse components. But what's really neat is that he does kind of map it all together using this overarching framework and puts it all together. And so I think that's pretty sweet. My system is totally cobbled together with, cron jobs and Python scripts, and yoicks. It's a disaster. When I have to debug something, it's log into the little server, find the right script and fix it. And that's not very professional. I'll admit it. And this is definitely the kind of bigger, more complicated take on this. And it's probably what you'd want to do if you wanted to scale up to the size of a small factory. Probably one step beyond normal home automation. But that's what I love about it, is the overkill.
Well, wrapping up for me, I have a ham radio hack from VA5MUD, which is, I guess, an interesting call sign in of itself. And it's a super portable, tunable VHF antenna. Hams have a long reputation of just taking stuff and making it work. If it's, the joke is to load up your gutters or to load up a lawn chair. And he has taken webbing off of lawn furniture, cut it into shape, put HVAC metallic tape on it, 3D printed a little adapter, and put a BNC connector on it. And he has a metal tape antenna that by moving the little 3D printed piece, you can tune it. So you can tune it for whatever band you're wanting to be on within, some limit, obviously. What literally a hack, right? I mean, in the best possible sense of that word. One of the things I wanted to talk about, though, and the reason I picked it for this week is, Dan does the great series about the $50 ham. And now that there's no code requirement, we see a lot of people, they get their ham radio license and they buy the $20 Chinese walkie-talkie or handy-talkie, as we would call it. And they talk to a couple of people on a repeater and then they go, well, that's boring. What do I want to do that for? But, the problem is that little walkie-talkie has a 4-inch rubber duck antenna. And so you get the range of, a kid's walkie-talkie, basically. And yes, there's repeaters and yes, all this stuff. But I think something like this, that's a very accessible antenna project that would perform a lot better, could be a real gateway drug for some of the newer hams to not only get into building stuff, but also discover that their radios have more interesting things to do than to talk to the guy 2 streets over or to the repeater and then the people in the repeater area. Granted, this isn't going to, work the world because it's VHF, but, for example, apparently one of the things that this particular ham does with it is they go to the parks and there's people who collect, I've got a card from someone who was at Yellowstone Park and this park and that park, and I've got 80 parks, or the summits on the air where they climb to the summit. And this is a very lightweight antenna, and it really opens up those kind of possibilities. You're not going to climb a mountain with your Baofeng 4-inch rubber ducky antenna and talk to very many people, right? With something like this, you could actually do a lot more interesting things. And it's cheap, it's easy, it's a great hack, and it's a great introduction to building some antennas out of mostly junk.
I love this antenna. I've tried to make a J-pole at least twice in my life and met with medium success. My experience with them is that they always couple with everything in the environment. And so tuning them to exactly the band you're at, exactly where you end up installing it is difficult. And this was a lot more difficult before we had like handheld VNAs and, cheap reflected signal meters and stuff like this. If you're trying to do it without the right equipment, it was really difficult. And that's what I like about this design in particular. You mentioned it. You just slide this little, buckle up and down the belt, and that changes the point it makes contact and thus the tuning of the antenna. And that's actually probably super useful when you're out in the field and you're hanging this thing maybe not optimally high off the ground and it's coupling with the earth, which is either wetter or less wet on that day. And, all that sort of, goofy stuff that happens when you take an antenna into the real world and out of its idealized mathematical cage or whatever. I don't know. I think it's a great design. It's really sweet. You can roll it up, right? Like, it's just a very clever design. And some of the J-pole ones, the first J-pole design we tried to make was like out of copper tubing, expensive, nearly impossible to tune because, you'd have to change the lengths of copper pipes. That's nobody's friend. This is so much better.
Yeah, my favorite little 2-meter antenna is to just take about 40 inches of coax, well more, but take 19 inches off the jacket and the braid. So you wind up with a 19-inch centerpiece with the dielectric still on it. Fold back the braid, so now you've got 19 inches of braid along the outside of the jacket. And then you just hang that. And again, you can tune it. It's pretty rollable. This is much better, though. This is just a clever piece. And I don't know how well it works, but I'm sure, like I say, I'm sure it works better than the rubber duck on your handheld. So maybe Dan should test this out for the next $50 ham installment. This probably costs $10 to make, so you could make 5 of them. Phased array J-pole.
Yeah. My first quick hack comes from Mink, aka Atul. This is DIY Pocket Pong breaks the mobile spell. This is a sweet little 3D printed OLED ESP32 couple of potentiometers used as joysticks for playing Pong. It's a little pocketable game. It's just a absolutely beautiful 3D printed design here, and I think that's what's really cool. Among other things, the OLED screen is actually heat staked in place, so he leaves little standoffs that fit into the screw holes on the board, and then he smooshes them down with a soldering iron, so they lock it in place. Very cute. All of the other parts, like the little buzzer that beeps when it hits your paddle and stuff, are press fit into their own little 3D printed pockets. It's an absolutely beautiful design, and then you combine that with the fact that Minik here is in 10th grade and has probably been 3D printing all his life. This is what 3D printer native looks like, people. This is a beautiful project. Speaking of sweet 3D printing projects, Cute CO2 Gauge tells you when to crack a window by Cyril is another. A gauge, you can make one with a servo motor and just like a stick on it. This takes that to the next level by making a sweet 3D print that fits around the servo motor, and he makes a very nice dial for it out of Inkscape, and that's the whole story. If you want to make some fun gauge indicators that can be hooked up to your Wi-Fi network and display various statuses, this is a great template for that. And last up, repairing a gear with a candle and some epoxy. This is a YouTube video by Well Done Tips, and maybe it's a little bit clickbaity, but I did think the technique was kind of interesting, which is to just realize that a gear repeats the same part over and over again, and so you can make a mold from it using paraffin wax, so it's like a melted candle, and then use that to pour the epoxy to fix up the part that's busted. I guess I'd never thought of using melted candle wax as a mold for making stronger epoxy parts out of, and I think that's actually what I'm going to take away from this video.
My quick hacks, Tony Gocher had faux silkscreen on a PCB made with a laser cutter. So if you make your own PC boards, which, you know, I've done many times but not a big fan of, there's always the problem of how do you make them look more like the boards you get for $2 now from China. And one of the things that's usually missing is the silk screen. So there's lots of ways people do that. You know, I've done laser toner transfer just to get the markings, or you can do water slide paper. You could write on it with a Sharpie. But in fact, Tony actually used a laser cutter to actually cut into the fiberglass. Lewin wrote it up, and he did say, quote, PCBs aren't really an ideal engraving or laser marking material. I think actually it's pretty toxic to laser cut fiberglass. So I'm thinking if you don't have a laser cutter in an enclosed ventilated space, this is probably a super bad idea. But, you know, if you're cognizant of the safety, it makes sense. There were a lot of comments on this one that were good too. For example, could you maybe put a black paint on the board and then use the laser to just cut away the paint and not maybe the fiberglass? That seemed pretty practical to me too. Next up, modern microcontroller boosts classic logic analyzer to new heights from Ted Freed. We've had this conversation on the podcast before. I actually have some of these old school logic analyzers, and they're awesome pieces of work, but of course not very practical these days. So he actually connected the microcontroller of some sort to it and used the map mode of the device, which actually lets you essentially plot points on it, and he made it into kind of a vector scope. But it's great to see these old pieces of gear work. A lot of them are pretty interesting on the inside. I'd love to see this one torn down. I don't know what's in this one, but like the Gould that I have is actually a really nice 6800 computer system with a bunch of Echo hardware and a big Horkin giant 5-volt supply that burns out every couple of years and has to be repaired. I thought that was a cool one. And last but certainly not least was from Chris Borge. Thrift store CD rack turns into small part storage playground. I'm one of these people, I'm not terribly organized, so this was a 3D printed bunch of little CD cases that fit into some thrift store CD holder that hold things like bits and other little small parts. And it was pretty interesting. Of course, it's 3D printed, so you could customize it all that you want. And of course, you could also store CDs in it. I thought it was interesting because you could have actually done this with just using jewel boxes probably, but this looks a lot better, especially for things that you can organize. And it got me going down a rat hole. If you look on some of the other links there's a bunch of systems out there that people have built that are some sort of storage device like this, where they also keep their inventory, and some of them are even voice activated. So you basically go up and say, hey, storage rack, I need 500 ohm resistors, and one of the cabinets lights up, right? So you know where they are now. You just go pull it out. Well, I guess I don't have a 500 ohm resistor, a 470 ohm resistor. But what a cool idea. Now, my problem is I'm so disorganized, I'd never keep the inventory up, and it would all just be a mess anyway. But it's still nice it's something to dream about. So I liked that one.
Quick hacks.
All right, that brings us to our Can't Miss articles. These are fantastic pieces written by our lovely Hackaday writing staff. This week I wanted Julian Sheffer's Why x86 Needs to Die. The article ends up being not quite as controversial as the title, I will say that. Julian is doing a bunch of looking into CPU designs and I think even designing his own in his spare time. So he's got CPU architecture on the brain. And looking at the x86 line of CPUs critically has led him to conclude that it's kind of running on borrowed time. And that's, I guess, what he means here. In the beginning of the article, he traces out the history of the x86 from actually the 8086, like one of the first CPUs around. But the 8086 gave birth to the 186, the 286, the 386, the 486, the Pentium, and then all the rest on through the Xeons and whatever else we got these days. I don't even know what they're called. The point is that a lot of these processors have retained backwards compatibility with the older chips, including, but not limited to, the 8086. One of the things he points out that this means is that they've got essentially just layers and layers and layers of instruction sets put on them, and they support all of them. And so, if you can remember that funny graphics extension that they came out with in the mid 90s, that's something that the x86 system still has in it. They all support real mode, apparently, which I didn't even know. Which, is that right?
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yep.
That's cool.
Every time you boot the computer, it thinks it's an 8086 from 82 or whatever the date was on those.
Absolutely incredible. And real mode's just a mode where it's able to directly address memory, which sounds like no problem if you're used to playing around with microcontrollers. But if you want to design a much bigger system that does multitasking and virtual memory spaces and address randomization and who knows what else, protected memory, it's a very dangerous mode to have kicking around still. I think his strongest point, and the one that was newest and most interesting to me, was that the x86 family does speculative execution. That is, when it comes to an if branch, it'll execute one of them, hoping that that's the one that actually comes up in reality in order to pre-read, pre-fetch, and pre-do some of the work so that it can do 4 or 10 times as much work at the same time by kind of parallelizing all these things. It takes the branch even before you take the branch. And this has led to kind of the Spectre attack on one hand, and also to an incredible amount of complexity in the chip itself, because the chip has to know in its microcode which of these different paths can be run out of sequence and which can't, and which can be run speculatively and which can't. And that makes for incredible complication at what is essentially a kind of a firmware-y layer, because the modern x86 chips don't actually implement all this in silicon straight up. That would be far too complicated. Instead, they have kind of a smaller computer inside and then this microcode layer that maps all of these archaic functions that nobody even uses anymore into the actual chip in there. And I think that's his main point at the end, is that this system is just too weird, too complex, prone to making errors, but also makes the chip design a lot harder, and it makes it harder for people to learn. And so the simpler systems like the ARMs and the RISC-Vs out there are probably on the upswing, not just because they're cheaper and faster, maybe not faster, but maybe cheaper, but also just because they're easier to comprehend. And so they'll get taught in colleges and grad schools, and people will be more comfortable with them, and they're easier to build the silicon for. And all of that is actually an advantage to simplicity, and that through its 40, 50-year lifespan, the x86 has just accumulated all of this other cruft that it has to handle, and that it may be that the time has come to give up on the backwards compatibility, stick a fork in it, and move on to the next.
Honestly, there's been a couple of attempts to do that. I totally agree with Julian, by the way. I think he's right on. But there's been a couple of attempts to do that, and for whatever reason, it just doesn't ever seem to work out. However, the ARM has certainly taken a lot of market share away from x86. And if you think about it, the security issues aside, you are eating up silicon to have this thing go, oh, I can address 64K of memory and I have no memory protection and I'm going to run in that mode for all of 3 seconds before I switch over to actually run the real processor that everybody actually wants to use. Just for what? So that we don't have to rewrite the BIOS code. Well, they have now, but for years that was probably a lot of it. There's a lot of different things that come up, and I don't know that the things like out of order execution, speculative branching, and superscalar, multiple instruction dispatches, I don't know that those are really ever going to go away because most real CPUs do that past some certain scale. If you ever look, there's a great book on that. Most colleges use it these days. It's Computer Architecture, A Quantitative Approach, which is by Hennessy and Patterson. And it's in its 6th edition, and it's the size of like the Metro New York phone book. But it turns out there's very little of this that's new. Seymour Cray at Honeywell and then later at Cray, they were doing all this back in the 70s where they would do we're going to execute 5 different instructions at one time. Well, what if one of those instructions modifies something the other instruction is going to use? Well, it'll have to be stalled. That's a hazard, right? And they do things like register renaming. So you say, well, I'm going to put this result in this register that doesn't have a name. And then later, if it turns out that really happened, I'll call that register R2.
Right. Yeah.
R2 used to be over here, but now it's over here where I put this answer earlier. Those things go on all the time, and that's one reason why you have all this microcode. But the trick is, if I didn't have to support 40-year-old operating systems and 40-year-old BIOS and things like that, I could probably reclaim some large percent, not large, not more than 50%, but 5% of your silicon. What could you do with that? If nothing else, you could have a bigger cache, right? Which is going to be better for performance. Same way with the operating systems. Every operating system, including Linux, has to have some wacky thing that happens when you boot up so you can get the processor into protected mode and into, as you say, the real mode that everybody wants to use, and that will protect programs from one another, provide rudimentary security, etc. So you're carrying around this huge amount of overhead just because, 5 people want to run their point of sale system that they don't want to rewrite, and it's, 1984 code and they need real mode for it. That may be part of what's helping people like ARM is that they don't have to carry all that, right? So Intel's almost carrying their own millstone around their neck, and they've been able to innovate fast enough that it hasn't made a huge impact, but at some point you're going to have too much, it's going to slow you down and somebody else is going to go faster and maybe win the race. Thought it was a super interesting post, and if you have any interest in CPU architecture, it's a good read.
Yeah, and some of that is just, the weight of history and whether they can get themselves out from under it. Because like you say, it has been tried before and they've thought about it before. And if they stop supporting SSE, somebody's code somewhere is not going to run, and they're going to be sad about it. And so I think that's one of those tough decisions for a company that's like the incumbent, the big company in the industry like Intel is that they have to. I know the Microsofties complain about having to support old hardware, day in, day out as well.
We just did the piece on how color TV came to be, and it was the same problem, right? Everybody said, well, we want to have color TV, but it'll break all the other sets. And then that didn't work because you weren't going to go buy $1,000 TV that only could get programs 30 minutes a day, and you still had to have your black and white TV to get the rest of the day's programming. So it failed. And then the correct system was one that superimposed the color with the black and white. There were some trade-offs for that. There's some black and white TVs had a little bit of noise in the video, and you had a limit on the bandwidth because you were using a subcarrier, yada, yada, yada. You could do a better system if you just said, no, I don't care about that. But the reality of the market was you couldn't get it started without being compatible with the black and white TVs. And I think it's really kind of the same thing here. If Intel every 5 years said, okay, get rid of all your hardware, redesign all the motherboards, all the chipsets, then people would be unhappy. But at some point it's got to change, right? We got to wean ourselves off of real mode eventually. Well, I picked Lewin Day this week. The hunt for alien radio signals begins sooner than you think. Lewin's post is about how long people have been thinking, gee, what if there are other people out there and maybe they use radio? And it turns out in 1924, they actually had a radio silence day because Mars was getting close and they wanted to see if they could hear any radio signals coming from Mars. And I don't know why that struck my fancy, but it really did. I guess part of it is I sure would like to have some proof there's some aliens out there because you feel like there must be. But, obviously everything that comes up has been less than convincing. Even in 1924, they apparently had enough radio noise that they knew they needed to be quiet, which is crazy. I would have guessed it would have been much later than that. Obviously, they didn't hear anything from Mars. I don't know if Mars puts out any radio signals. Jupiter does, but of course we don't think they're from the Jovians. We think it's just from the planet itself. But it's still interesting that people even that far back were reaching out to see if they could hear anything.
Well, I think back then they were actually looking for little green men. I mean, this was, what if there is life on Mars? Shouldn't we be listening? And it seems like a crazy idea from today, but you don't know until you try, right? On the other hand, if they had better radio telescopes, they wouldn't have had to worry about quieting the rest of the Earth. You just, tighten that cone down till all you hear is what's coming from Mars and you're good to go. I love the idea though, and like you say, it's a huge gesture toward, saying, is there going to be life out there? And Lewin says, it was a moment of wide-eyed optimism. The hope was to hear a crackle from a speaker. I think that's right. And that's exactly what's so charming about it. Although apparently they had trouble stopping all of the radio stations from broadcasting for a whole day because,
Yes,
they kind of had work to do. Y'all can listen to Mars later. We've got a broadcast to attend to. Just the idea that you would listen for it is pretty cool. And so we're looking at a time though when, radio's been around for 20 years, 30 years as a useful tool. And already they're saying, let's quiet down and listen to see if anyone on Mars is sparking at us. I think that's lovely.
and then you wonder, it'd probably be some ad for long distance service or something if they did contact us. Mind you, have you considered the advantages of owning a really fine set of encyclopedias? I don't know. I've always been interested in SETI in general. I know the speed of light doesn't change, but I always wonder how you correct, and I don't know the answer to this, how you correct for differences in time dilation for modulation. So in other words, sure, the carrier frequency may not change, but if you're modulating it at what you think is 1,000 hertz and your time shifted, by a factor of a half, well, then it's going to go up, right, or down, depending on which way you think about it. And I don't know enough about how SETI has been approaching that to know if they consider that or not, but it's pretty interesting. And we've done some articles before on, if aliens contacted us, would we even know it and would we understand it? So the Drake message, we did that piece where he apparently distributed it or a version of it at some conference and no one actually got what it was. And those were all human beings. The chances that an alien's going to go, oh, look, I'll bet that's where they're from. And I'll bet that's one of them. And that's another kind of them. That's pretty hard to imagine. The other thing I always think is interesting is, there's the talk about, well, maybe the aliens are watching I Love Lucy, which was beamed out in the 1960s. But if you think about it, the amount of time that we were really broadcasting any kind of intelligible signal that you would have a chance of decoding has been relatively small. So a sufficiently advanced civilization who's talking amongst themselves is probably going to compress stuff. And what's compressed stuff sound like? It sounds like noise. So if you aren't deliberately trying to talk to us, there's probably a really narrow window where you have very inefficient transmissions going out. And after that, it looks like background noise because that's the most efficient way to do stuff. I don't know. That's just my musings. I have no proof for any of that.
That wraps it up for this week's Hackaday podcast. Thanks very much for listening. If you want links, they're over in the show notes, hackaday.com/podcast. And if you want to tip us off, send an email, tips@hackaday.com. And until next week,
Keep those hacks coming.
the 50,000...
Google's not being cooperative. That quadrature ship, excuse me.
Oh, I don't want to get into this. 2024 home automation, 24. Yeah, so this is, good. Thank you. Problem is, I don't know where I set it. Damn it.
I think you just got to start over. That's why I wanted to interrupt you quickly. Sorry. I'm really scraping the bottom today. How can you say that, Elliot? Oh my God.
Burp. Man, never Chipotle again.
Oh hell, where is my? Oh, there it is. We need to stop the recording.